Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Peter Schuck, and today we're going to be talking about his recent article for the eminent publication National Affairs. What systemic racism systematically downplays. Hello, Professor Schuck. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. Professor, what is systemic racism?
Well, I believe it's a pattern of racism that pervades every important system in the country, educational, sociological, economic, uh, uh, civic, and my claim is that systematic racism, although it certainly existed in the past and a not so distant past, today is not systemic. It is located in particular enclaves, but it's not systemic. And for those who insist that it is, I think they're doing a disservice to the progress that our society has made.
And I agree with you, Professor. You listed four reasons explaining why we should doubt systemic racism. Start with the first reason. Racism is declining and racist beliefs are also declining. Is this true?
Well, I believe that it's true. It's impossible to know, of course, because people don't uh, say explicitly what their motives are. But I think there are good reasons to believe that racism has declined a lot in our society. One has to do with the enactment of legislation, not only in the federal level, but at the state and local level, that prohibits many different kinds of manifestations of racism. A second is the denunciation of racism by virtually everybody who speaks about it. Now, of course, that could be hypocritical. That could be false, false testimony. But there's no reason to believe that people who say that they're not racist are in bad faith when they say that. Um, Another factor is that racism is declining in part because the people who traditionally were racist are dying out. They are literally dying out. They're primarily among older whites who have not only uh, uh, reduced lifespans, but are also suffering from a lot of the early deaths that have been documented in recent years. So, in that sense, the incidence of racism uh, is 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 declining as the sort of the soil in which racism flourishes is itself losing its potency.
There's
Those are
another.
some of the reasons. I think other reasons have to do with the commitment of most, if not all, important institutions in the society to end any remaining practices or vestiges of racism. We find that in the uh, movement, which is DEI movement, diversity, equity, and uh, inequality movements that have been adopted in almost all of our institutions today. So that is not to say that there is not still a problem of racism. I believe that there is, but just that its incidence and its potency have declined considerably. And I think we ought not to discredit those kinds of changes by claiming that it's really all the same. It's just more carefully concealed today than it was in the past.
When we talk about white privilege and critical race theory, we're going to run into a litany of issues because these terms are quite difficult to define. So Robin DiAngelo, she claims that white people can basically be racist without knowing that they're racist. Yet white people alone can solve racism. But how can you solve racism when you are not aware that you're racist?
Well, I believe that's completely wrong. It's irrational to make that kind of claim. There's no way to prove it, because any evidence that you might cite, she would say, I suppose, is simply uh, concealing the true racism that exists. So I don't take that. I take it seriously in that she has received a lot of attention for her book, but I don't take that as a kind of serious, scientifically demonstrated or even plausible account of people's attitudes.
And back to the issue of the decline of racism, I have written on the topic, and studies have been done showing that racist beliefs and racist sentiments are receding. So, pew, more people today are supportive of interracial relationships than 10, 20, and 50 years ago.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, that's true in every area of life, from intermarriage to friendships. The incidence of interracial uh, uh, relationships has increased a lot. One of the concerns I have about this insistence on systemic racism is that it plants seeds of doubt in the minds of people, particularly in the minds of minority people, as to whether when whites interact with them, they are actually concealing their racism rather than dealing with them on a relatively straightforward, authentic basis. And that kind of suspicion, I think, plants uh, real seeds of conflict, where what's needed is more assumptions of good faith and genuine efforts on the part of people to overcome the legacy of racism that we all, or most of us, would certainly acknowledge and want to put behind us.
And the minorities are not necessarily complying with the position of systemic racism. According to Pew, blacks and whites, their views do converge i- under certain circumstances. So, for instance, Black Americans also agree that if you are not successful, that is due to your own inefficiencies.
Yes, I think blacks and whites are similar in this respect. They're not identical in their attitudes, but they're similar in that they take responsibility for individual behaviors, and they have respect for those who have succeeded, and they wonder about the those who have failed, wonder what the sources of those failures are. Sometimes the sources of those failures are endemic and structural and um, place enormous obstacles in the way of advancing. But often I think those failures are the result of mistakes that people have made, poor choices, and blocked opportunities that hopefully are being opened to them.
And before we begin to talk about the role of the family and other social issues, there's a striking point in your article, and I must read it for our audience. In 2020, the FBI found that although the largest category of hate crimes, 61.8%, were based on race and the ancestry bias, the number of these incidents was under 6,000 nationwide. In a population of over 330 million, this surely does not qualify as systemic. Explain.
Well, I think it's almost true by definition that a number that's that small can't be systemic. If the overwhelmingly vast majority of crimes are not hate crimes, then that suggests that the incidence of hate crimes is really quite low in our population. And although each incident is is to be uh, criticized and chastised and regretted and prosecuted, that's altogether different than saying that our society is pervaded by systemic racism.
Now we're going to talk about immigrants and the family. First, starting with immigrants. In your paper, you note that Black immigrants, their households have a higher median income by about 30%. Why is this the case?
Well, there are there are a lot of reasons. It's impossible to know precisely what the contributing what percentage of the outcome is explained by each of these factors. But first of all, immigrants are not randomly selected. Immigrants tend to be people who are highly motivated. They're prepared to leave their countries. They have generally higher skills than the people they leave behind. They are better educated, better trained, and in order to emigrate to the United States legally, they have to pass through certain guidelines and criteria that make them more likely to succeed than most of the people from the countries that they have left. So that's one factor. Second, we know from our studies of immigration that that immigrants tend to be more optimistic. They tend to work extremely hard. They tend to um, uh, build communal ties that help them to succeed. And these and many other factors make immigrants much more likely to succeed than the average minority person.
And I must point out that in Africa, the selection for high quality immigrants is even stronger because it's more difficult for the average African to get a visa. So in Jamaica, anyone basically can get a visa. In the early 80s and before, it was harder to get a visa, but we have an embassy. People can relocate from rural Jamaica to urban Jamaica to get a visa. But in Africa, where most people are poor, some persons could be suffering from illiteracy, and where financing is a problem. So Nigeria is a poverty capital of the world. So if you're going to travel to the urban area to get a visa, you need money, and you might not have money. So in Africa, the selection for more intelligent immigrants and more hardworking immigrants is actually stronger.
Yes, that goes back to my initial point that that immigration is not random. It's not a random process. Those who are able to obtain visas, and even those who come illegally, tend to be people who are more highly motivated. They're more likely to make sacrifices for future gains than the random person in the societies from which they come. In some ways, it's not so surprising that they would do relatively well. In addition, this phenomenon that I've just described and that you just confirmed is well understood by employers, and studies have been done. I'm thinking particularly of some work by Mary Waters, who's a sociologist at Harvard, um, of employers' attitudes toward uh, immigrant blacks and Native American blacks. Um, and those attitudes tend to be quite different. They seem to think that immigrants will work harder, will work more uh, uh, carefully, are more highly motivated, or more cooperative, and have certain other characteristics that make them superior employees when compared with blacks coming from the United States, as people who were born here. Um, I'm sure it's a complicated process, and sociologists like Waters and Orlando Patterson, who studied this, certainly have probed the factors that may explain these differences, but they tend to coalesce. These differences tend to coalesce to create an impression and a reputation on the part of that employers and landlords and other people who are providing jobs and services to minorities tend to agree upon. And so it's partly it's observation, partly it's their own experience, but in any event, they tend to favor the immigrant black over the native born black, other things being equal. Other things aren't always equal, but other things being equal, that's a kind of a prejudice, a good, maybe a good prejudice that we find to be very widespread.
I am not surprised. In the 1990s, sociologists did a study. It was a survey of employers, and the results at the time indicated that employers wanted to employ more Black Americans, but they had a problem with their work ethic. It was done years ago in the 90s, an old study, but it's a running cliche in some circles.
Well, I think there are such studies, and as the kind of patterns that I just described among employers suggest that that's a widespread view, and it probably gets confirmed in the sense that when they hire immigrant blacks over native-born blacks, and they're satisfied, they tend to reinforce that particular view, call it a prejudice, even though I was careful to say that it may be a good and accurate prejudice rather than an invidious one. Word travels fast. Reputations are important, and people talk to one another about their experiences as with certain types of employees, and that produces a sociological preference for immigrants.
Professor, let's talk briefly about the culture of working class peoples. Usually, when individuals refer to Black culture, they're really commenting on working class culture. Now, sociologists argue that working class people are present oriented in contrast to upper class people who are future oriented. One reason for present orientation is that poor people literally have to think about tomorrow. It's more challenging for them to think about next year or the next 2 years. So their life planning horizons are shorter, while others have various explanations relating to IQ and genetics. But could the problem be a result of the working class status of some Black Americans?
Well, you're referring to people's time horizons and the extent to which they are present oriented or future oriented, and whether they are willing to make sacrifices in the current period in order to improve their options in the future period. I think there's a great deal of sociology and cultural studies that support this idea. In a way, it makes sense, common sense. It's not all that surprising that people who make sacrifices in the present are more likely to reap the benefits in the future. I say more likely. This is it's a probabilistic claim. It's not. It doesn't happen in every instance. There are a lot of people who work very hard and sacrifice in the short term in hopes of doing better in the long term, and it doesn't work out either because they're just unlucky, or they become ill, or for a variety of other reasons. So we're talking here about likelihoods and probabilities and statistical regularities. We're not talking about certainties. Um, so I think that's true, and it's true not only across races, but it's true within any particular culture, that people who are more provident, who plan for the future, are more likely to reap the benefits of that in the future. Now, it's also true, as you said, that if people are very, very poor, it's much harder for them to save and to make those kinds of sacrifices in the present in hopes of gaining more in the future. That's really true, and so this is why life is very, very hard for poor people in any society.
Yes. And obviously, the traits that evolve in some working class communities may not conduce success. And people like Patrick Sharkey and others, they have written on the issue how your environment can shape your life trajectory and social outcomes and also perceptions of life. So for some people, it may be more attractive to become a gangster and not go to school.
Yes, that's true. And I have a section in my paper, which you haven't mentioned, in which I talk about, and I've written about this at greater length elsewhere, about people's individual choices. People make choices throughout their lives, especially when they're young, that have large consequences for their futures. Often they don't even know that they're making these kinds of choices, or that the choices are going to have those future consequences, but they do. And I list a whole bunch of them in the article, in which people's future status is often determined by the choices they made when they were younger. And unfortunately, lots of poor youngsters make bad choices. And it's very important for our society to reward the good choices, even as we try to persuade those who are making bad choices, at least choices that are going to diminish their future prospects. Even if we try to make those good choices more attractive to them, and the bad choices less attractive to them.
And this is one reason for the disparities in students being punished. If African American teenagers are not properly socialized, they lack a father figure in the home, and as a result, boys especially become problematic in school, then they're going to be suspended. So can you really compare such boys to Asian American girls?
Well, that's a very important point, and a very difficult one for us to absorb, because it appears to be favoring certain groups over other groups, and that's something that we ought not to do, except on the basis of good evidence. I think an awful lot can be explained by the different home environments of different groups, and the um, and we have lots of evidence. Unfortunately, we have lots of evidence of how the home environments of poor children who are Black children who are raised in poor environments are really deprived of the kinds of conditions in which they can flourish. Now, some of them flourish anyway. There are always these remarkable success stories. So there are lots of examples of kids who manage to overcome these obstacles and and do well. But when we talk about statistical averages, it's going to affect the ability of a youngster to have the kinds of make the kinds of choices that will benefit him or her in the long run, including how hard you study in school, how long you remain in school, what kinds of people you hang out with, whether you engage in petty crime at a young age. Many decisions of that sort, many decisions that are health related, many decisions of this kind have important consequences for the future, but that young people, partly because they're young, and young people often don't weigh the consequences in the long term of their actions. That's part of what it means to be young. They make choices that make it more difficult for them to succeed in the future. And I think this is an extremely important difference between those who prosper and those who don't prosper that we often disregard. And you referred to school discipline. There are those who believe that the differences in the amount of school discipline meted out to minority kids and white kids are the result of prejudice on the part of teachers and school officials. And I think that point of view does a disservice to the schools that have to maintain order and classroom peace in order for the low-income kids to have a chance to use their educational opportunities to stay in school and hopefully have brighter futures.
And this is what charter schools appreciate.
I think that's true. I'm a fan of the charter school movement in general. There are some terrible charter schools. We should understand that. And there are some charter schools that ought not to be rechartered or ought to be put out of business. But in general, the idea behind the charter movement is that there are ways to nurture educational opportunity for low-income kids that are more effective, and that the charter schools tend to have more flexibility, partly because they tend not to be unionized.
Professor Schuck, hold on, please, Professor Schuck. So I am going to end this segment of the meeting to send you a second link. Apparently, Zoom is now forcing us to upgrade. It started like a couple minutes ago. I didn't know. So I have to end this section to start a new section.
So what should I do?
You're just going to check your email for the new link. That's all. All right.
I don't see it.
Not yet. Not yet. Hold on.
Okay.